It's 12 o'clock noon, and we've got folks in Fairbanks, folks in Anchorage, and I believe a few remote participants. And I'll start off by asking you to put phones on mute as we all share line here. This is the bi-monthly, approximately Northern Latitudes webinar series. It is the 5 Alaska Land Cooperatives and the Alaska Climate Science Center. Alaska LCCs are public-private partnerships that are working on issues that are too big for any one agency, and those big landscape-scale issues that affect everyone. And today's webinar is one that really hits on that scale of the work that we do. Today we're very happy to have Marcus Geist from the Alaska Center for Conservation Science at the University of Alaska Anchorage. Marcus is someone who's worked on natural resource and environmental issues across Alaska, North America for a couple decades, and worked with LCCs, including projects that include a lot of complexity, like understanding where all water quality and temperature monitoring stations are across Alaska. And to take on the project of managing, understand where the human footprint is across Alaska and Canada. This project involves a lot of complexity, just a lot of data sources, and a lot of interdisciplinary thought to be able to bring those together and find meaning in those so that we understand what's going on today and can make plans for tomorrow. I will mention, too, that on October 17th, the next webinar will be one from the Audubon Society. This is Building a Better Bird Map, the Audubon Alaska 2017 Ecological Atlas of the Bering, Chukchi, and Beaufort Seas. And it is much more than a bird map. It's an extremely extensive project that brings together a lot of data across the Bering Sea, Chukchi Sea, and Beaufort Sea. So October 17th, approximately same time, same place. That's a Tuesday at noon. Ask that you keep your phones on mute today. We will be recording this, and we will have a video up at the Northern Latitudes YouTube site. And let me just switch over to our presentation here. Okay, and I'll hand it over to Marcus Geist from UAA.
Okay, good afternoon. Thanks for the introduction, Ben, and thanks for the opportunity to speak with people here in the room and folks on the phone. So this project began, I believe, about 3 years ago with the Northwest Boreal Landscape Conservation Cooperative, and I'm always upset when I get to the end of a presentation and I don't tackle the acknowledgements here. Ben is helping me out. So I'm going to just tackle that right off the bat. The LCC has been a funder throughout this project, and I've got a number of collaborators at the University of Alaska Anchorage listed there, Dr. Jamie Trammell, who's now at Oregon University, Megumi Aisu, and Priscilla Lema, and also worked quite a bit with LCC partners in the Canadian Beacons project team at a number of locations throughout Western Canada, and they were really helpful throughout, particularly with the Canadian side. And then some of the Canadian source data came through Ducks Unlimited Canada as well, through a separate LCC project. So just a little bit about myself. I grew up in Pennsylvania. I wasn't a coal miner's daughter, but I was a coal miner's grandson and nephew, so I kind of grew up around mines and so kind of got me interested in the environmental field. And then ironically, it also got me interested in the natural resources field. As Ben mentioned, I've worked here in Alaska for a while, and prior to that, I worked both in the state and federal regulatory environment. And that's why I have this stoplight up there, because I'm working as a regulator, and then I worked for the U.S. Army Alaska here I was part of the regulated, and I also worked with an engineering consulting firm helping agencies comply with environmental regulations. And one of the issues that always seems to come to bear is our systems are set up to permit, and we're sort of in a green mode until systems are broken, and then we kind of switch to a red. And I feel like if we had a better understanding of cumulative impacts on our landscapes and cumulative impacts at kind of meaningful scales, such as watersheds, we might be able to insert that yellow light and sort of have a cautionary element in our environmental and natural resource management systems here. So that's a little bit of background about how I came to the project and just some of my background working prior to this one. So a little bit about our Alaska Center for Conservation Science. It is, if people knew about the Alaska Natural Heritage Program, that is still alive, and it's just housed under the umbrella of the Alaska Center for Conservation Science, and our staff is here in Anchorage over at the university on campus now. So we serve up a number of data sets and have an array of scientists, biologists, zoologists, aquatic ecologists, and such. So why are we mapping the anthropogenic footprint beyond just it being an LCC project? One of the challenges is this LCC spans multiple jurisdictions, Alaska, Yukon Territory, British Columbia, and Northwest Territories, and is often data coming from a variety of sources, so having an ability to synthesize that was important. As I mentioned, measuring cumulative impacts at meaningful scales and being able to kind of subdivide that giant LCC into meaningful scales seemed quite important. And then in addition to sort of highlighting areas that have been impacted, using this project to help identify intact ecosystems, areas that maybe we thought the whole area was intact, or we thought parts of it were broken, and this was just an attempt to discretely quantify some of those impacts and areas where they weren't present. So how we were going to do that, a lot of what the office that I work in over at the Alaska Center for Conservation Science does is stitch data. And that may just be where we have data on the Canadian side and data on the Alaska side, and where they mesh up really nicely. However, sometimes those data don't mesh up very nicely, and then sometimes we're mosaicing data. And in that case, we have things that are like in this image here, we have this stained glass, and we have, well, we'll just group all the blues together, and maybe we'll group all the oranges together. They're slightly different shades, but for the sake of our project, we're going to group them together. And so that's one of the sort of means for bringing data together, is we're mosaicing things that are alike but maybe not identical. And then in some cases, we're having interpret data. So sometimes we have information that isn't fully digital or isn't fully spatial, but has some components of both of those, and we may do some interpretation. An example of that is we might take data right off the shelf from a municipality or a borough, and it's like, oh, there's their roads data, but without a little bit of interpretation, you might accidentally plot, dozens, if not hundreds of miles of planned roads that are in their data set, or unconstructed roads. So without just a little bit of interpretation, you might mistake a footprint, in that case, transportation footprint. So we talked about the why and the how, and then at the end of the presentation, I'll sort of discuss some of the what we found out and some of the products and means for you all to sort of explore, provide feedback and ideas for revising some of these projects. And a lot of this is just on the right-hand side of the screen, an extract off of our webpage, and I'll have a link to that again. Ability to sort of consume this information in a variety of manners. The LCC is massive, and as you can see, about half of it is contained over in Alaska, 30%, better than 30% in the Yukon, and I would say that 30% of the LCC is like 90% of the whole Yukon territory. So almost all of the Yukon territory is within the boundary of this LCC, and then small portion of Northwest Territory, and then northern British Columbia as well. It's pretty big, as I said, 1,800 kilometers across and 1,000 kilometers kind of north to south. And we thought, well, we need to look at the footprint. Let's just look at communities. I mean, we know that people have footprints, and so we could begin to look at cities, and then we can look at towns and villages, and those are sort of easy points to start from in terms of looking at what we would think of as a discrete built landscape. And then we began to look at transportation, in this case, these rail lines, and in some cases, these were some of the first sort of transportation footprints on the landscape. So then we began to look at trails, and some of these trails were historic and predate Alaska even as a territory. But this is sort of our first often kind of stumbling block where we have to turn back to those methods that I mentioned before in terms of stitching things together, mosaicing things, or in this case, interpreting. And interpreting sort of off-the-shelf data sets on trails lead to questions of access. On the Alaska side, we have a number of trails in our state Department of Natural Resources inventory of trails that are winter access. So some of those trails are just following rivers, right? They're just following the Kobuk River or just following the Yukon River. Is that really a footprint? By June, there's really nothing left of that trail, right, as we pass through breakup. So do we want to include some things like that? There may be some impacts from those trails in the wintertime, but they're really not so much of a footprint. Our definition of trail may vary quite a bit. If somebody is able to go hiking on it, they would call it a trail. If somebody is able to take a four-wheeler on it or a snow machine, those would all qualify as trails. And other people may look to drive a larger vehicle, an Argo, or they may look to drive a truck or a tractor. All of these qualify as trails. So, and I would point out, too, on the Canadian side, the trails issue is also a bit muddy. The northern portion of the Yukon there, that's just under the word transportation in the title, you see this enormous sort of growth of trails, and I began to sort of investigate that with imagery and satellite imagery, and saw that some of these trails were quite faint, and most of us would probably look at them as more or less game trails. They were, I think, one-time use trails for seismic testing, and once we get to the energy side of the footprint, we'll see that that area has undergone quite a bit of oil and gas exploration. But so we not only encounter trails as to their sort of physical dimensions, but then just their usage. Are they used only seasonally? Are they used once or twice? Are they used on a kind of day-to-day, week-to-week basis, or year-to-year? In some cases, some of these trails have perhaps only been used once or twice. So this is where we start to get a little muddier. With roads, I think we have a much stronger sense of a definition of roads, and they include all these different surface types: paved, gravel, dirt, and there are not too many surprises here in terms of the road network that we know of on the Alaska side and the road network that we know of on the Canadian side. So airports are another sort of discrete transportation footprint on the landscape, not only just the footprint of the runways, but then the potential impacts that could kind of radiate out there in terms of the access that they offer. And so these are all these are all packed runways, as opposed to, obviously with float planes, any number of places could be accessed. So other than the trails, I think the transportation footprint is not overly surprising on either side of the Alaska or Canadian border. And here is a look at kind of that combined transportation footprint, and this is including all of these trails that sort of span that giant range of usage. And so these were all gathered from fairly traditional data sources, GIS and data management entities at the territory and provincial level on the Canadian side, and at the state level on the Alaska side. In the oil and gas energy sector, as I said, as you can see up in the northwest portion of Canada, there's been, or of the Yukon rather, the north portion of the Yukon, there's a considerable amount of exploration that has gone on, and then within the Alaska portion of the LCC, it's Cook Inlet, and then a bit kind of in the Nenana Basin, southwest of Fairbanks. So, so the bulk of our work, and these were also sort of gathered from pretty traditional sources in terms of agency information. These are pretty discrete entities, and they're fairly recent too. We didn't have oil and gas development 100 years ago, so record keeping on well locations and lease locations is pretty sharp. The resources are quite valuable, so and they're usually taxed. So that's a strong incentive for the government entities to keep good records on locations and dates and things like that. So we move into sort of the longer history of mining and looking at the human footprint from mining across the region. A lot of these mines predate certainly predate any kind of digital record keeping. Some of these records would exist as individual recording offices solely on paper, and given the sort of scope of the project, we began to look for some alternatives to making visits to all of these various recording offices with photocopy machines and things like that, and scanners. And so so that was a flag for us to find some other means to find historic data rather than go to recording offices. We also knew that these operations, unlike, as I said, the oil and gas, because they tend to be a pretty major operation in this environment, they range from very small mines to quite large industrial modern mines that we have. So some of these small mines would also pose challenges because they wouldn't have a lot of digital record keeping or much record keeping at all. And then it's just a vast geography, whereas the oil and gas was concentrated in just a few discrete locations. That Cook Inlet area of Alaska and then the northern Yukon, mining has occurred across all of the northwest Boreal landscape. So we knew that we would be looking at something that was going to span the whole geography. So these were some of our challenges moving forward, and then I'll just sort of go over some of the ways we tried to hurdle them as best we could. So the kind of modern mines, so these are mines that maybe have been developed over the last decade or three, the last like maybe 30 or so years. All of those traditional data sources on the state, provincial, and territorial side have pretty decent location information, and so so we've got, I guess, said kind of these modern large industrial mines located pretty well. But part of the challenge was just discerning how big some of those are. I mean, I could just vary the dot size, but I don't really have an idea of how large the footprint. Some of these mines operated for just a very short period of time, and due to any number of circumstances, global mineral prices or some of the challenges in development, never occupied much of a footprint, whereas some have been in production for quite a while, and their footprint is quite large. So this was helpful to have this, but we felt like we needed more if we wanted to really quantify the aerial extent of these projects. We could use things like claims, but we knew that this was a gross sort of overestimate, because in many cases the actual footprint of a claim may solely be these corner posts that are marking that claim, and maybe the footprints of the geologists who've hiked across it, or perhaps maybe a very short-term drill rig on site or something like that. So we knew that claims, while they were helpful to show us the possible extent of development, they really were a gross overestimate of the actual footprint or landscape disturbance. And then both the Canadian and on the Alaska side, the agencies managing this spatial data have begun in the fairly recent past, like within the last 10 years or so, begun not only mapping current claims, and those are sort of in the brighter oranges, but also in some of these lighter beige and yellow colors, mapping some historical data. Now, when I say historic, that's maybe just going back 10 years. So we're not going to capture, booms of placer mining that occurred in the 20s, say, or in the teens. So historical needs to be sort of defined as very recent past. So we knew that these dots were a gross underestimate because we just had points, and we knew that these claims were a gross overestimate, and so we were left, well, what kind of other sources might we find? And through some of our work with some other projects, we knew about this Alaska Resource Data File, which is a huge inventory. I think it's about 7,000 records. It's maintained for a number of folks, primarily Rick Wilson, who's a geologist here in Anchorage. And it's a catalog of mines, prospects, and mineral occurrences across the state. And so it's got a lat long. Sometimes that coordinate pair is pretty coarse. It may have just been generated off of an old topographic map or some, but in any case, it's a point on our maps, and we can begin to learn from those points a little bit. So what we did is we mapped that data set, the Alaska Resource Data File, and then selected specifically for, as I mentioned, it includes 7,000 records, but a lot of it are just mineral occurrences or prospects. And so we sorted out, did some querying, and pulled out placer mines, expecting that placer mining, just by nature, would be most likely to have a visible surface disturbance. And then we began to also look at some of the other mines that weren't specified, so they may have been placer, or they may have been mine of nature. And another data source, the third layer that's listed in this legend here on the map, is the GNIS, which is it's a USGS term for the Geographic Name Information System. And it's essentially kind of a catalog of data that might be on old topographic maps and labeled on old topographic maps. So we went through and queried that data set as well, looking for the word mine, and then doing, again, some of the interpretations so that I wasn't picking up old mine fields out in the Aleutians on ADAC or Attu and things like that. And so we kind of narrowed that down. And as you can see, we're up in, about over 1,000 sites, point locations across Alaska. These numbers are for all of Alaska at the top, and then within the Canadian portions of the LCC for those last two items in the legend. We had similar, although less extensive, records on the Canadian side for both Yukon and British Columbia. So these these were sort of our clues, our breadcrumb trail of locations to look at that gave us a much broader universe of sites that reach back to try and overcome that first hurdle that I mentioned, a mining history that spanned over 100 years. And then it also, because it incorporates mines big and small, it's attempting to overcome that second hurdle, which was that scale issue. And because it exists across the whole state, we sort of were tackling the third one, which is that vast geography. So some of the methods then that my collaborators that I mentioned on the acknowledgement slide began to do, and we sort of just honed our methods to say we're gonna look at our best available, and part of the reason we felt like we could work on this project now is that the whole state of Alaska is covered by ortho imagery now at like a 2.5 meter minimum pixel size. So we felt like we could see some of the disturbance, whereas in the past we just had 30 meter Landsat data across vast stretches of the interior, and now with this better imagery, and then also we have some better digital elevation models, the DEMs, and I'll show that in the second example here. But so we set a particular scale, like 1 to 10,000 on our view on our desktop, and with that you have a range of about anywhere from 2 to 4 miles that you see on your screen, depending on the size of your monitor. And so we felt like that would help accommodate some of the geographic uncertainty of those point locations from the Alaska Resource Data File, that ARDF that came from the USGS. And so in this case, we start with that star. That's the point that we get from the ARDF source file, and we look in the upper right-hand corner and we see some visual disturbance, and then that's sort of our clue to move over there and then begin just some heads-up digitizing of the disturbed area with tailings and buildings on site, and then in some cases roads. So this is the basic method followed across those few hundred, well, I guess a little over 1,000 points across Alaska. Another visual aid has been the availability of high-resolution digital elevation models, so the LIDAR or IFSAR that's available across portions, certainly in the Fairbanks area and across a good bit of the Mat-Su. We have LIDAR, and then IFSAR is available through other parts. And so on the left hand, that first image we see is just sort of aerial imagery, aerial photography, and the disturbance is pretty clear. And then the second picture, or the second image, is the digital elevation hill shaded relief, and so some of the man-made sort of forms are quite visible, especially some of the roads that might be relatively thin and difficult to see if there's some tree canopy there, but they show up pretty well, especially if you're zoomed in and this is kind of on your desktop, and we're able to digitize disturbance in that realm. So, so those were some of the methods, some of the results. We've got 646 currently unique footprints, and so some of those footprints may incorporate multiple mines, either successive mines that have occurred sequentially in time. You know, somebody may have come back to a site and reworked it, or mines that have sort of grown together. You know, they were adjacent. So out of that 646. You can see the breakdown between Alaska and Canada, and almost 500 were within the Boreal LCC. So we tried to map across all of Alaska and across the Canadian portion of the Boreal, just because that's where we had the best data. The aerial extent of that footprint is like approximately 1,200 square kilometers, about 700 stream miles, and that's using the NHD. So that's just on the Alaska side. That's using the National Hydrographic Dataset, and then the Acknowledgements Waters Catalog on the Alaska side. And on the right-hand side, we've got a snapshot of a fact sheet that's on our webpage that kind of describes both those methods that I just went over sort of in a graphical sense, the data sources that we used, and then highlights a few of the watersheds. So those would be like the 10-digit HUCs, if folks are familiar with that scale of hydrography. We summarized these footprints at that scale, and then we've listed those as well. And so I've got a number of these data sets all available on, products. So some of them are data sets and some of them are products. What we just looked at there was a fact sheet. That's just a PDF. It's just a product. We also have links to some of the other products that I'll go across. I'll go through here one by one. Just a summary map highlighting on both the Canadian and Alaska side the 10 watersheds with the greatest map disturbances. So these are just surface disturbances, I should say. And so that's just a map of surface disturbance. It's not necessarily a reflection of water quality within that watershed. It's just visible surface disturbance. Some of these areas could very well stabilize considerably. Others may still be pretty dynamic in terms of the stream banks. But there's just, as I could point out through the methods, a very clear removal of vegetation and in some cases a pretty direct alteration of the terrain. So rather than use the word impact, we're using this word disturbance to feel like it's a more accurate description of what we have measured thus far, which is just, as I said, kind of a surface footprint. There's a multi-page kind of annotated legend to sort of describe some of those data sets that where I had some maps early on with mines as points and the mining areas as claims. So this just kind of walks you through where those data sets came from. Many of them, particularly the claims, are pretty dynamic. They change on a almost daily basis. And they kind of rise and fall with mineral prices and administrations at sort of federal and state and provincial levels. So that's why we kind of provide those here. This is just a snapshot in time. There is a link to our GIS Online web mapper, so people can go online. And in this case, we've just got a few data sets turned on here. Pretty difficult to see against this imagery, but there's some purple lines that are sort of delineating the disturbance. And I've also got a pop-up window enabled here where we've clicked on one of the point locations. So these were the source files that we used to find the initial disturbance. And there's quite a bit of description about that particular mine site, maybe when it was first mined, and the different minerals maybe that were extracted there. So you can toggle on all sorts of data. That's an option for people. Another option is the footprint layer itself. So that polygon layer of the footprint, the disturbance footprint, is a web map service. So people can add it straight into their ArcGIS desktop if they want. Or if you have an existing web mapper, you can add it in as a layer as well. And the nice thing about that is that we revise this data set, and if you're linked to this web map service, you'll see those same revisions. So it's not like having to re-download a geodatabase or a shapefile. There's a layered PDF map as well. So again, for folks that maybe are offline or the online variant is challenging, or in this case, want to look at the entire breadth of the LCC. We've got everything kind of mapped on one layer, and it looks a bit messy all at once, but as I mentioned, it's a layered PDF, so just in Adobe Reader or Acrobat, you can toggle on any number of the layers. So on the left-hand side, it just sort of functions much like a GIS in terms of people can toggle on all of the mining layers at once, or maybe just toggle on specific elements of those layers. And so if there's a particular area you want to zoom into, you can kind of get a sense of whether data have been digitized in a particular area of the LCC on the Alaska or Canadian side. Next steps, I'm going the wrong way here, are to publish out on that product side map package, which would just sort of be all of those data that we just saw on the layered PDF, but rather than get it as a PDF, essentially emulate my desktop at ACCS at the university on your desktop if you wanted to see all those data, that snapshot in time of the mining claims, the mining footprint, the mining locations, and all of these other sort of ancillary information. You could grab that. It might be a pretty big download. You want to make sure you have some decent bandwidth. So that's one of the end products, a data inventory in sort of a sortable Excel file so people can easily look through. That information is already on that annotated legend, but this would just make it a little easier, I think, for people to search through and hit links to the source data sets and some ISO, which is International Standard Organization, and FGDC, Federal Geographic Data Committee, metadata for that GIS layer. Right now we have kind of that graphical metadata for the purposes of explaining things. That fact sheet in sort of lay terms explains it, but we'll also provide it out in sort of GIS speak as well to be compliant. And then other next steps, I would say that this is a first draft, and every day that I open up the data set, I sort of cringe a little bit because I'll see a spot that maybe our team missed, that maybe I should have gone through a little bit more. This isn't the end of the project. We're certainly open to feedback, and we're open to suggestions of other data sources. Like I said, I knew that there were lots of data sources that would be kind of non-traditional in filing cabinets and things like that, but as a first cut, we wanted to take what we knew that was partially digital, in this case the ARDF, the Alaska Resource Data File, and then make it more spatial. Other next steps, working with the Fairbanks Office of the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Fisheries group, we'll be looking particularly at the Yukon drainage, which is, within the LCC, almost entirely within the LCC boundary. And specifically then, another data source that we haven't yet used are the fish and game fish habitat permits, which apply to placer mining. And so those traditionally have just been paper and then scanned to PDF, but not made digital and spatial in sort of a geographic information systems format. And so being able to capture kind of more current and recent activity on the landscape would be useful. And then to use this information to see, well, where else have we begun restoration projects that we might piggyback on some of those or add to some of those, and then also look at where monitoring is occurring in relation to these footprints. So that project is just starting and should continue through the coming year, working with Jimmy Fox up there in Fairbanks and other colleagues. So with that, hopefully we think we still got a little time, even with the explosive microphone early on. So thanks to Ben and the LCC and everybody else who's a partner within the Conservation Cooperative, or if you're just listening in.